Chapter 4, On the Run. While growing up on the island, I was a diligent student and loved school. But almost immediately after we moved to Florida, I became unfocused, going from a straight A student to barely being able to pass my classes. Without the love, support, and encouragement of my grandmother, I looked for those things outside of my home. I found what I thought I had been looking for with the neighborhood kids. We started hanging out during my free 2 hours after school. Soon after, I started skipping school altogether in order to extend my socializing hours. I would attend the first few classes and leave the campus for lunch. Sometimes I would go home and sometimes to a friend's house. The majority of my friends were boys. It was easier for me to fit in with them, and I found it difficult to have girlfriends. I'm guessing that was because of the roles my parents played in my life. With my father being gone, I had always been looking for his replacement, and with the already damaged relationship with my mother, I would never feel comfortable around other girls. Sorry, y'all, I done talked my throat dry. I never respected or liked them. During the days of cutting school and hanging out, I was also drinking heavily and smoking. This became my routine. At home, I confined myself to my room, which was fine with my family. I didn't fit in with my mother and my two sisters, and in many ways, I resented them all. I read a lot, usually mystery novels, anything written by Agatha Christie, such as And Then There Were None, Cat Among the Pigeons, and The Hollow. Agatha took me to another world where the events leading to the ending of the novel were unpredictable. I enjoyed not knowing what was to come and would rush back to my room between meals and chores to find out who had been killed and why. I was also a great fan of poetry and stories and studied the works of Maya Angelou and Edgar Allan Poe. Maya wowed me with I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings and Phenomenal Woman, and Still I Rise. Maya gave my spirit strength with a mothering voice, while Edgar Allan Poe took me back to timeless and formal elegance in literature. I studied his techniques in such poems as The Raven and Nevermore and his short stories. I discovered myself in books and in music. I listened to the radio, singing along, pretending, imagining myself a star. I would reenact scenes from my favorite films and rehearse my acceptance speech to the Academy in front of the mirror. I spent time writing poetry and recording all my thoughts and pains in my journals, becoming increasingly introverted and an outsider in my own home. Of all the Christmases I spent with my mother, one, when I was about 14, made the biggest impression on the rest of my life. From the day I came home after being raped, my mother began to tell anyone who would listen what an awful child I was. She told friends and family members that I was evil and on drugs. When the beatings were particularly vicious, I reached out to counselors and officials at my school. I reached out to counselors and officials at my school. I showed up at school with bruises, lacerations, and even a sprained neck. But my mother had them all fooled. She lied to cover her actions and made me out to be the bad one, eventually succeeding and making everyone dislike me. Things had become inverted since we left St. Thomas, and now she was the good guy. This particular Christmas, I left my room and walked slowly into the living room. There were maybe 45 presents under the tree, and my little sisters were tearing away at their wrappings as my mother sat on the couch snapping pictures. I walked closer to the tree, and my eyes began roaming around the base of it looking for my gifts. I wasn't expecting much, but I was excited just the same. As I was looking, my sisters were yelling and screaming with joy to see the gifts my mother, as well as gifts sent from her family. My mother's family had always been split, her mother's side and her father's side. Once we moved to Florida, she disconnected from her mother's side and only acknowledged her father's side. I stooped down and began kneeling so I could get a better view under the tree. I cleared away the mountains of torn wrapping paper and ribbons and pushed my sister's gifts to the side. I continued to look, and as I did, no one said a word to me. No one even acknowledged my presence. I retreated from the Christmas tree once I realized there was nothing there for me, not one thing. My mother had made everyone believe I was unworthy, and no one in the family showed me love during the holiday. Of course, her father's side of the family believed what she said. They never loved. They never known me. They had never loved me. My heart sank into my stomach as it became a few degrees colder in the room. My mother could have never gotten away with this if my grandmother had been around. She had purposely disconnected me from my roots. She had brought me to this town to figuratively kill me off. I would have to fight to stay alive. I closed my bedroom door behind me and plowed into my mattress. At first, I began to cry, but then I received a phone call from a boy I liked that kids in the neighborhood called Bam Bam. He was older than me, around 19 years old, and had just moved to Florida from Queens, New York. I couldn't remember how we met, but I was glad we did. He was so sweet to me and would always ask me how I was doing. He always wanted to know if I had had a bad day and what was wrong. I answered the phone to hear, "Hey, baby girl, Merry Christmas." Smiling from ear to ear, I replied, "Hey, Bam, I'm not doing so good. I didn't get anything for Christmas and no one even spoke to me." Bam Bam seemed as disappointed as I was and said, "Don't worry, baby girl. I'll get you something. I'll have it for you when I see you again." He made my day and hung up. Sorry about that. He made my day. I hung up the phone and lay in my bed feeling better. I replayed that conversation in my head over and over. Over the next few years, things at home would continue to deteriorate. I decided to fight back. I told myself that the next time my mother put her hands on me, I would hit her back. I cannot recall exactly what the issue was on that day, but I do know that when my mother hit me, I kicked and punched back. I fought for my life that afternoon in the hallway of our apartment. "Oh, you want to fight?" she screamed. "You want to fight? You can't beat me. I will kill you." And I believed her. I didn't win that fight, and I realized I couldn't stay. I packed a few things, left my mother a note, and snuck out of my first-story bedroom window. I was running away and had no intentions of ever coming back. I do remember what was packed, but I don't remember what was packed, but of the few belongings I was taking, my Wu-Tang tape. My Wu-Tang Clan tape was my most treasured. It was my first hip-hop tape, and it would never soon serve as the soundtrack to my first taste of voluntary freedom. I played that tape until the ribbon popped. I had been on the streets for about 2 weeks, going from pillar to post, staying with friends and friends of friends. Everyone I knew was older than me and had their own apartment. I stayed with the older boys, and I even stayed at an abandoned house of a guy who had been sent to prison. I was not alone, however. Charlene, my best friend, came along for the ride. She and I had never discussed what took place that night. I was raped, but we still remained friends. I don't know how, but let me continue. We were soon met by some other runaway girls who frequented the area and knew the guy who owned the abandoned house. I was homeless, underfed, and on many days dirty, with nowhere to take a shower. What I hadn't realized about this abandoned house was that it was in a crack-infested, prostitute-ridden neighborhood. I was so naive. One time, I was standing on the corner with a couple of the girls from the house at, at the local liquor store asking for change to buy food, and a stranger in a car invited us back to his place. We jumped into the car with a Jamaican stranger. I was eager to get something to eat and a place to shower. In retrospect, I realized he thought we were hookers and he was looking for a good time at our expense. Fortunately, back at his place, his friends didn't want us, and we were consequently returned to the street corner where the guy had found us. Still, I would rather have lived in this abandoned building with no lights and no water, begging for food and money in the worst neighborhood in Tampa Bay than go home. It seemed almost impossible to imagine now, but I lived on the streets for close to a month. One Saturday night, I was hanging out on the strip where there were teen clubs and places to eat, a movie theater, and such. This was my first time in this part of town, and my first time hanging out like this. The night air felt cool and inviting on my face. We were all smiling and laughing and carefree. Charlene and the other girls from our place, we all were all together. We're all there together, acting like the kids we were. We weren't concerned about a thing. We didn't have any money or anywhere to go at the end of the night, but we were happy to be there among our peers. I was the happiest of all. I saw friends from school who I hadn't seen since I had run away, and they all let me know about the signs my mother had posted around the school and the neighborhood. I knew she would be looking for me, but I was shocked when I turned around to see her standing right behind me. There was my mother with her best friend in tow, side by side with a few members of the Tampa Bay Police Department. Her arms were folded tightly, and I could see the look of fire on her face. She gave me an eye, and I knew my life would never be the same after this night. Suddenly, her look changed from anger to concern and relief. It was a big act for the police. The police asked me why I left home, and I began to tell them about the beatings, about the time she hit me with a 2x4 wooden plank and hurt my neck, and all about the times I tried to tell the counselors in school but would come in and do the same thing she was doing now, lie and act. They can tell you, I said to the police, pointing to my friends. They know. My friends nodded in compliance. I knew this was my only chance. I had to convince the police that I was telling the truth. If I went home with my mother, I thought she would surely kill me. You're lying, my mother shouted. None of that ever happened. Why are you lying like this? Her friend chimed in. I don't blame her friend. She only had my mother's perspective to rely on, and my mother did a good job painting the ugly portrait of me. She had turned the whole world against me, making them all think that I was on drugs and even that I was possessed by the devil. She told everyone I was a whore and that I had been having sex with all my guy friends, and when nothing could have been further from the truth. She defamed and degraded my character. I couldn't let her win on this night. I wouldn't. As I stood there in front of the police, I cried my heart out and begged them to believe me. I had become hysterical with desperation and began to hyperventilate. I was placed in the back of the squad car. 2 officers came, sat up front. Calm down, it's going to be okay, the officer on my right said. We're here to help you. He was there to help me. The very concept had became foreign to me. I felt as if no one had been on my side since we left St. Thomas. I had no one in Florida. There was no one to burst into my room and rescue me from her. Now it seemed as if someone might. Now, if you don't go home, we'll have to take you to juvie, the officer said. I don't care, I said without hesitation. Take me. You won't have any clean clothes there, he said. And there's a uniform you'll have to wear every day. It's not as nice as the things you have on now, and the food is not so good either. And the other kids, they aren't nice like you are. I did not flinch. Take me, I said, because if you send me back there with her, I will kill her. If I don't, I am certain that she will kill me. If you send me back, you'll just have to come get me in the morning, again in the morning. The look in the officer's eyes as they met mine, determined and defiant, gave me hope. The decision he made changed my life yet again. Where's your father? He said. I began to sob uncontrollably. I don't know. Well, what's his name? Kenneth. As soon as I blurted out the name of my father, the officer jerked himself out the car and went over to my mother. I could see him take out his pen and pad and begin to scribble feverishly. Within seconds, he came back in the driver's seat. Here's his name and his location, the officer said. He's in Phoenix. I was confused. I had no idea what my father would be doing in Arizona since the last I had heard he was in New York. Nevertheless, I was relieved. Before my sisters were born, my mother and I would run back and forth to New York from St. Thomas, chasing behind my father. When I was 5, she moved us into a tiny fourth-floor studio apartment on the corner of Parsons Boulevard and Hillside Avenue in Jamaica, Queens. The hallways and stairwells were littered with homeless men who pissed on the walls and floors. On occasion, I would look outside one window in the apartment adjacent to ours and see a fat, naked man with a long, grizzly beard, guzzling liquids, and stuffing his face with leftover food from God knows where. I could look down the alley between my buildings and his and see the trash heap forming and dog-sized rats running and ravaging through it. This was poverty at its finest. I had been living in it because my mother was ever hopeful she could win my father back. My father often came to see me, and on quite a few occasions he would take me back to his house in Central Islip, Long Island. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. I loved it there. Leaf Avenue was a beautiful street lined with towering oaks and 2-story homes nestled on either side. At the end of this long picture-perfect street was a church, and every hour on the hour the church bell rang. To me, it was a constant reminder that I was safe and that God was there. I was 6 around this time, and my father had 2 other daughters, Tony and Jennifer, from a previous marriage. Both Tony and Jennifer were more than a decade older than me. We played outside with other neighborhood kids, and they would try to teach me how to ride a bike, a 2-wheeler. And my feet could barely reach the pedals. I stretched my limbs, trying to impress my big sisters. There was always a family of squirrels scurrying out of the way and up the trees, and if they knew I was new at this. I remember so many things about that house in the neighborhood, the sound, the smell, the people. The house next door had burned down, and I thought to myself that our house must have been protected by God because it was unharmed. I remember catching fireflies and lightning bugs and putting them in glass jars, placing them beside our beds as we slept. They would be dead by morning, and we would replace them with new ones every night. At the church at the end of our street, they served free lunch, and like clockwork, my sisters and I were there. Peanut butter and jelly, sandwiches, milk and cookies. Those were good days for me. They were simple and I was safe. My father had gotten my mother a job at B. Altman's department store in Manhattan in the men's department. He was a buyer at Bloomingdale's and had connections. My mother seemed happy. She did everything she could to be what she thought he needed. But I learned that my father was only tolerating her for my sake. This was obvious from the way she would beg him to stay when he visited our apartment, from the way she would become infuriated when all he wanted was to take me back to Long Island. During the days and weeks that I spent on Long Island, my father had no use for my mother because he had me. This made her furious. So one day while my father was at work, my mother came to the perfect house on the perfect block in the perfect neighborhood and took me away. My father's mother, Merrill, and his father, Edmund, and my sisters, Tony and Jennifer, watched as my mother snatched me up and drove off. I kicked, screamed, and cried. Please don't take me. Please don't make me go. Please let me stay. Please, please, I cried. She slapped me and told me to shut up. I reminisced to myself about those days as I sat in the back of the police car in Tampa, Florida. I was finally hopeful about something. I was looking forward to the possibility of seeing my father again. If we can track your father down. We would like you to go live with him, the officer asked. I couldn't get the word yes out of my mouth fast enough. I said it twice to make sure it came out right. Yes, yes. To my surprise, the officers worked on finding my father right then and there. They would not release me into the custody of my mother until they found him. We found your father. Now tomorrow, we are all going to work on getting you to him, the officer said. But for now, you'll have to go home with your mother. We've spoken to her and she's promised us she will not lay a hand on you. Get there, get some rest, get your things together. It looks like you'll be going to Phoenix. I smiled and cried all at the same time. Could this really be true? Was I finally going to be leaving this hell? Was I really going to be safe and see my father for the first time in almost 10 years? The deal was made. I would go home with my mother, but not for long. I was Phoenix bound.